CGTN, China Global Television Network.
环顾当前当今世界
The world today is in greater uncertainties and destabilizing factors. Peace and development are far from being achieved in many parts of the world. Close to 400 million people in Africa and 40 million in China live under the poverty line. China and Africa need to join hands in fighting poverty and achieving common development. This is our responsibility to future generations, the shared objective of our people, and the inherent part of human progress.
最终的脱贫。
China and Africa need to join hands to fight poverty. Now that is the central theme at the China-Africa High-Level Think Tank Forum taking place here at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. And thus experts from China and Africa discuss poverty alleviation for common prosperity. How will the solutions derived here address the developmental priorities of African countries, many of them at varied stages of development? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa from the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. Now, in the wake of uncertainties facing a changing world environment, cooperation between China and Africa in jointly addressing challenges facing the world economy is becoming key. The Africa-China think tank is one such forum. Girum Chala tells us more.
This is the first high-level forum organized by the African Union and China. It aims to alleviate poverty through shared experiences.
Both China and Africa are now standing at a new starting point for development and rejuvenation. We have the confidence, we have the ability and wisdom to strengthen solidarity and cooperation to fight against poverty, strive for common prosperity, and jointly embrace a brighter future.
It is also an opportunity for me to express my happiness and pleasure to see the relation between China and Africa flourishing.
To combat poverty, China has laid out a 5-point proposal for Africa. It includes synergizing development strategies, peace and security cooperation, and human resource development.
We will deepen cooperation with the AU to build closer partnership, to guide China-Africa solidarity and cooperation and promote our common development, and provide new impetus to our comprehensive strategic partnership and cooperation.
AUC chairperson Moussa Faki Mahamat has welcomed China's proposal.
On most issues, we have a convergent view with China. So this obviously corresponds to Agenda 2063 and also the priorities as identified during this think tank forum.
Participants say this platform offers much needed insight into development policies for the continent. China has also pledged $100 million in military assistance for Africa to reinforce its peacekeeping missions, and it has promised to support efforts to expand the capacity of the African Center for Disease Control. Grumtala CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Agricultural modernization and industrialization have been touted as some of the most immediate priorities for Africa's economic transformation. Now, on the sidelines of this forum, I sat down with Professor Emmanuel Nadozie. He tells me exactly what Africa is doing to tailor solutions that are best suited for Africa's local conditions. Professor Nadozie, thank you very much for your time. I want to start with a comment made by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Then he talked about tailor-making development plans to suit local situations.
Yes.
When we talk about African policy making, are we tailor-making our plans to suit our local situations?
Well, I can say yes and no. In some countries, this is happening, and they have learned the fact that you have to have development within the context of your own reality, your own history, your own size, your own resource endowments, and every other thing that you can think about. You can learn lessons from other countries, but you need to adapt them to your own, local reality. Especially if you, for instance, if you're a large country that is multi-ethnic, that has multi-ethnicity, so managing diversity becomes an issue. The same way that a country that has one ethnic group would approach development would not be exactly the same way you have to approach that. A resource-rich country and a resource-poor country would have two different things, different ways to approach the development. So I agree with the minister that adapting development to the local conditions is a very important prerequisite.
You just mentioned that Africa is diverse, different levels of development. So what kind of development plans is Africa putting in place in the diverse countries so that to ensure that poverty is alleviated, particularly as we head towards Agenda 2063?
Well, the result is also mixed. A country like Ethiopia has really made a lot of strides, judging from where it came from in terms of having large amounts of poor people, but in a single generation it has managed to really reduce this in a respectable manner. But unfortunately, if you go across many other countries, the reduction is very marginal. We had the story about China today. In 20 years was able to really put 700 million people out of poverty and bring them into economic progress. But the kind of policies that one has to put in place, as I said before, are policies that are well thought out and reflect the reality of a country. The reason I'm saying that is that the Gambia is less than 2 million people. Nigeria has over 170 million people. So the policy that Gambia will put in place will be totally different from the one that Nigeria will put in place. But one thing, there are things that are common. A country must have a growth that is at least double-digit, very high levels of growth, what I call quality growth, that is also sustained for a period of time in order for it to have an impact on poverty. So growing at 4 or 5% is not going to cut it. But again, it has to be broad-based growth, and especially growth that affects the areas where poor people are, whether it's in agriculture or in the informal sector or in other areas. That's how you can make an impact. But if you want to sustainably reduce poverty, you've got to have a jobs or employment policy, because what you call the missing link between growth and poverty is employment. Ultimately, jobs have to be created.
You have mentioned that there are countries that are resource poor and that are still lagging behind, though.
Yes.
And you've made a comparison between one large, one small, though. But for those countries that you feel are lagging behind, what is the challenge for them?
Well, the challenge for many African countries is actually a challenge of leadership. Unfortunately, we have to call a spade a spade. Because no matter how good a strategy you have, no matter how good an intention you have to move forward, and look at all these countries, they all have fantastic, we want to be emerging economy in 2025. We want to, be a middle-income country by 2020. We want to have this growth and structural transformation program everywhere. All of them have very good plans. But some are not able to really translate this plan into development results, reducing poverty significantly, diversifying the economy, providing jobs for young people, and improving the sort of women. Now, the point is, because in the countries where it is happening, you will see a visionary leader who is also holding people accountable, and who is not only having a vision, but also ensuring that the vision is implemented, and who has paid attention to a critical factor which is hindering Africa's development, and which is the lack of capacity. And that's where the African Capacity Building Foundation comes into the picture, that we have tried to bring this back at the center of the debate, to say if you don't have the critical technical skills you need, if you don't have the number of skilled workers, if you don't retain them in your country and fully utilize them, you're not going to move forward. You will only have good plans and bad results. You have to strengthen your institutions as well. So institutional capacity is very important. And then, of course, the last one where leadership falls in is the soft capacities of the changing mindset, creating leadership at all levels that will drive this agenda.
Well, the AUC chair did mention as well that part of some of the reasons that has made some African countries lag behind are issues such as slavery, issues such as colonialism that have impacted on Africa's development plans. Does Africa recognize that, though, and what are we doing about it?
Well, there's no question that history has an impact on contemporary situation. It's difficult for us to really correctly estimate the impact of slavery or how long it would take for its legacy and impact to wear off. I think I worry more about the neo-colonial situations than the colonial issues, because after all, politically speaking, many countries got independence for over 50 years now. But the international environment and the geopolitical arrangements may not have completely liberated African countries, especially from an economic standpoint. If you look at it, Africa is not represented in the international arena in any meaningful way. Only one African country in the G20. Africa is not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. If you look at other international bodies, you see that Africa is also either not adequately represented or does not have a voice. Yeah, but I would differ a little bit on that, to say if African countries are waiting for somebody to come and develop them, they will have to wait for a very long time. Countries that have moved forward took their own destiny in their hands. Whether you have resources or you don't. Actually, when I say resources, let me qualify it. Whether you have natural resources or not. Because every country has resources. It could be human resources. It could be natural resources. Korea did not have natural resources, but it did focus on the one that it has, which is human resources, and make sure they were very well educated. They paid attention to making sure they are very well skilled and that they are fully utilized. So if we pay attention to our educational systems, and once and for all, ensure that the African universities educate African young people to solve Africa's problems, and also ensure that we pay more attention to technical and vocational education and training programs that will actually make young people to be employable or self-employable, then we are beginning to talk.
I'm hearing that you're very optimistic, so I want you to give me some examples of some success stories on the continent and what you think they're getting right.
Well, success stories, unfortunately, in the past we couldn't say many, but these days I think we are very, very happy to say that quite a few countries have made some progress that are really, really notable and remarkable. In this country where we are, it's an example of transforming the agriculture, which has really made a dent in poverty. They've also embarked upon an industrialization program focusing on manufacturing, because they recognize that there will be migration of manufacturing jobs. Over 50 million jobs that will be migrated every year from outside, from China and the rest of them. And so they recognize that putting the conditions right and the business environment right will help them to be able to attract some of these investments. So that's one example. You go to Mauritius, and also everybody knows that that's a country that has been able to really move from just being a sugarcane producer to a country that has a highly diversified economy. In terms of growth, a lot of African countries are among the highest growing countries in the world today. And the continent has come a long way. It was able to withstand the global economic crisis and was able to maintain respectable growth rates in spite of all the global economic challenges. But the continent cannot continue to depend on export of, primary commodities.
So at the end of the forum, of course, participants here want a take-home and a focus for this forum. What will that be, and what will be the follow-up mechanism for this?
Well, what I heard that was extremely gratifying is the fact that, number one, China indicates that it recognizes Africa's interest in the process of supporting the continent, that it will take Africa's interest into consideration. If you compare this with the sort of partnership that Africa have had in the past, you will see that it is more or less a partnership that was not necessarily geared towards the interest of the continent or on equal terms, where Africa has a similar equal voice and the respect and the recognition that it deserves. So that is a very important dimension coming from the Chinese. The second thing that I also heard is that they are willing to continue the support using the mechanism of FOCAC, especially in the major area of infrastructure development, which is the thing that is hobbling Africa's development moving forward. And believe it or not, the one single investment or factor that can really help poverty to be reduced significantly is infrastructure development, believe it or not. whether it's energy or water or, railroad and road transportation and so on and so forth. It does transform things. So their willingness to work with Africa in really doing this infrastructure development is something that I believe will be important. The third thing is that they're also talking about the green development approach, which means that they are thinking that you cannot, in the process of trying to support development of the continent, do that at the expense of the environment. Because African countries, although some people will argue that you are not one of the culprits in terms of damaging the environment and creating greenhouse gases and creating climate change, but Africa is the number one sufferer of this problem. And as a continent that will be most affected by climate change, it needs to be a bit more sensitive to the issues and even lead in the process. So focusing on green growth development by China, I think, is a welcome issue. But having this kind of mutual respect engagement that takes the interests of Africa into consideration, and try to really support Africa based on what African countries, determine as their priority, not coming to dictate to the continent how they should do things. I think this is my major takeaway from here.
All right, Professor Nnadozie, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll take a look at the different approaches in tackling poverty on the continent. To stay with us. Africa is not one story. And now to give us further insight into Africa's efforts at poverty alleviation, I have my expert guests here, Professor Garth Lapierre. He's a professor at the University of Pretoria, Department of Political Sciences. Welcome to the program. Also, Professor Li Xiaoyuan, he's from the China Agriculture University. And also with me, Charles Ochekuchu Onunaiju. He's a director, Center for China Studies in Nigeria. Charles, let me start off with you because I want to get all of you, your overview of Africa's efforts in poverty alleviation. Give us a brief overview of what you have seen so far in terms of Africa's efforts in poverty alleviation.
Well, you see, this is historical. There has always been a great vision of African leadership at the start, to get life of prosperity for the people. The whole essence of the struggle against colonialism is to hand over Africa her own destiny so that she could make her people prosperous. Ironically, that didn't happen 50 years after we had an independence, and we are now restarting on another platform to advance this vision of poverty, eradicating poverty in Africa. And I think what we have done here today was to synergize with our Chinese friends on the perspectives, on how they did it. Because we've also seen a successful experiment in pushing back poverty. And I think the perspective that have been generously expressed both by our Chinese friends and of course African scholars will combine very effectively in giving us a new momentum in challenging the poverty.
Let's look at that new momentum from China's side in challenging poverty. First, what are your views, though? What do you think about Africa's poverty levels at the moment? Are we still that far back, 50 years after independence?
And I would say the first, because when we talk about the experiences and the lessons from China, and we have to be very careful that African is not one country, and we cannot make a comparison between the China and the African in a very simple manner. And at the same time, the experience and the lessons from China can really provide some kind of reference for Africa. The critical issue for me, and I would say from Chinese perspective, Africans poverty reduction is that the decoupling between the growth and the poverty reduction. So we look for last 10 years, even the last 10 to 15 years. If you look for African's growth record, and African is okay. You know, African has been performing and in a very good manner. And from 6 to 7% the growth rate is really high. However, at the same time, you see the poverty reduction performance is not really satisfied. From that point of view, I would see what China has achieved in high economic growth associated with the poverty reduction, dramatic reduction of poverty. And the critical issue, there's two areas. One is technically speaking, and how to link growth and the poverty reduction. We have to really look at the transformation, you know, effective transformation.
Professor Lepere, I want to hear your views.
In my view, I think the Africa Rising narrative is somewhat exaggerated because the growth has been rather parochial, concentrated as it has been in countries with extractive industries, essentially oil. There are very few countries that have grown in terms of a productive, dynamic momentum. Essentially, the growth is driven by demand for commodities. It is rent-seeking, static growth. It is not based on productive capacity. That productive capacity is sorely lacking, and that is why the figures of unemployment and inequality are so stark. If you cannot address the structural problems of inequality, low growth, unemployment, you will not be able to address the bigger structural problem of poverty.
Right. Charles, I want to get your view.
Yeah, well, this population dividend or this demographic dividend that we so much talk about in Africa, in my view, is a real challenge because, like Mao said, if you have a population that has no productive capacity, it's basically a heap of sand. You know, if it does not have labor, if it does not have labor implication, if it does not have implication to transform the economy, it's simply lay dormant. So the dividend may remain still potential without realizing it, except it is actively transformed into a productive labor force that transforms the economy. Be that the case, I want to say very frankly that the broad question, the issue of policy questions are implication of interpreting an existential reality. Except you solve the problem, the fundamental problem, you cannot get along with the routines. Routines are policy making. They are simpler. It is much easier to grasp the fundamentals. That is the experience of China, grasping the fundamentals, understanding the fundamentals, and readjusting your policy implication according to your interpretation of reality, taking into account existential facts about the international situation and your peculiarities as a people. Without this, policy somersault will remain our bane. And in as much as it remains our bane, we will continue to chase the same question. It is ironic, poverty question was the core question. The core promise of post-independence is that when Africa is free, when Africa can govern itself, we can get our people fed, we can get our young men. 50 years, 60 years after, we are still addressing this question because the fundamental has not been deeply and profoundly appreciated. That is why the policy implication has not fitted in properly to the fundamental framework.
Let me get your views here because I know Professor Lee mentioned earlier that we should not really compare China's situation in Africa. But Professor Lepere, I want to get your view here. What similarities or differences do you see in China's approach, in Africa's approach, in addressing poverty on the continent?
Well, I think, you know, for me, I think China got the institutional regulatory environment right. And by that I mean, you know, a very tight social contract between the institutions of the state and the party and the people at all levels of society. So you have sort of a broad consensus around what needs to be done in order to harness the energies of people. And this becomes very evident if you read Xi Jinping's book, Up and Out of Poverty, because it really chronicles his experiences in a very poor part of China called Nangde, and how he went about learning the experiences of people and then bringing them into this kind of social contract. I think lifting 720 million people out is that social contract writ large. Now, I think in Africa we've got the fundamentals more or less right. The broad regulatory governance environment has improved, not only in terms of democratization, but if you look at fiscal, monetary policy, the regulatory environment, The general environment for growth is there. It's just getting the institutional mix right and the political and policy momentum to drive it forward.
Professor Lee, China's population has been like 1.3 billion, able to feed its people. Africa's population is now heading towards the 1.2 billion mark, still unable to be food self-sufficient, for instance. So where is the disconnect?
And the issue here is that it's not really the population growth rate itself. Is the connection and the balance, because if you have a high labor productivity, even you have a higher population growth rate, you can still manage. But in African perspective, if you see the labor productivity both in agriculture and industry and other sectors very, very low. Therefore, there's two ways. One is that you look for the population control issues, and at the same time you're looking for the improvement of labor productivity. So that two issues. From that two perspective, it rather requires a kind of very, very, very careful and strong intervention from the state, through the state development policies. That areas we have today very clearly from our participants shared a lot that how China actually manage. But China has very different historical, political conditions, and it's very difficult for Africa to look at that kind of simply, but essence similar. Essence very similar. Essence means and how to enable the state to act effectively, looking at what you have mentioned, that kind of local context. And from that perspective, I see the African is moving. If you see the Ethiopia currently, you see, I've been here for over last 10 years, been here many, many times, and I have personally seen the progress. And I have also seen the country like Ethiopia and a country like Tanzania in Dar es Salaam also moving. So, and I see very, very optimistically, and the African countries moving in the way that not different from what China actually been doing, and different from what African has been doing before. So.
We're going to wind up in a minute, but I just want to get one final view from all of you, and very briefly though. Professor Lepay, I'll start off with you though. If there's one critical issue that you think could be implemented for Africa today as a recommendation for poverty alleviation, one critical aspect, what would that be?
Address the supply side constraints. Infrastructure, invest in education, build human capital, give people opportunities.
Professor Lee.
And look at the small-scale farmer and link that kind of into the value chain, and also look, the vocational training, vocational education system first, rather than look for the big education or university, everything. So.
Right, Charles.
Re-engage with the existential African reality to redesign the political, social, and economic infrastructure that is relevant to our challenge and our experience, and that will be very germane to our sustainable and inclusive development. Re-engaging this existential reality, in my view, is the fundamental. We must get it right before we can put on the planks of its policy implications.
Right, a very insightful discussion there. Gentlemen, I must thank you all. Professor Garth Lapierre, Charles Chuku Ununaiju, and Professor Lee Xiaoyun, thank you all for your very insightful dialogue here. And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. But you can continue this conversation with us by joining us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.